When she got on the plane, she was calm and quiet, wearing only a hoodie and sneakers. The flight attendant looked her over and told her she didn't belong in first class. As the other passengers watched, no one said a word. What they didn't know was that this woman owned the airline, and before the plane landed, the whole crew would regret underestimating her. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. She walked onto the plane without hesitation, pulling a small black suitcase behind her. Her name was Claire, and she moved with quiet focus. She wore a plain beige hoodie, dark leggings, and well-worn sneakers, and her curly brown hair was pulled back into a low bun. She didn't wear any jewelry or makeup, and she didn't try to look fancy. She wasn't here to prove anything. At the entrance to the first-class cabin, a flight attendant greeted her. A woman named Cheryl greeted her with a practiced smile. She looked at CLA's boarding pass and then at CLA, whose smile briefly changed into a look of confusion or doubt. She scanned the pass again and then stepped aside. "First class is here," Cheryl said in a polite but clipped voice. CLA nodded and walked to seat 1A, where she put her bag in the overhead bin without help and pulled out a small tablet from her backpack. She didn't look around because she knew what other people would see. A casually dressed young woman was sitting in a seat that most people thought was only for executives and elite travelers. She was used to that look. A few minutes later, Cheryl came back and sat down next to Claire's seat. She spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your seat?" she asked. "This section is reserved for our premium guests." Claire calmly held out her boarding pass again. Cheryl took it with a tight smile and studied it again, her eyebrows raising. "Well, it says 1A, she mumbled. "I'll need to double-check with the date. Sometimes there are system errors," she said quickly, turning and walking back toward the front of the cabin. A man named Patrick was sitting nearby, leaning toward his wife Rachel. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Rachel gave CLA a quick glance, then quickly looked away. Neither of them said anything else. CLA sat still with no expression on her face as she lightly tapped the side of her tablet. It wasn't the first time people had looked twice when she showed up out of the blue. She opened a private messaging app, typed a short message, and hit send. She then closed the app, leaned back in her seat, and stared out the window. Cheryl didn't know this, no one else on the flight did either, but they were about to find out. CLA stayed still in her seat, her face calm, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Outside the window, the runway shone in the morning light, but her attention was on herself. She wasn't surprised by what had happened. She had seen it happen before in boardrooms. A few rows ahead, people were already judging her worth before she even spoke. Cheryl went to the galley and picked up the in-flight phone. As she called the gate desk to confirm her ticket, her voice dropped low. She didn't call Claire by name. Instead, she said, "There's a passenger in first class who doesn't look like she belongs here, seat 1A. Can you check her booking again?" The tone wasn't worried, it was annoyed, like someone reporting a seat squatter. While she waited for the answer, Cheryl poured. While drinking her coffee and standing near the curtain, Megan noticed that one of the junior attendants was looking at CLA. "Is everything okay?" Megan asked Cheryl. "We've got someone up here who's probably in the wrong seat, claims she's got a valid boarding pass, but I'm pretty sure it's a mix-up." Megan looked toward the cabin but didn't say anything because she had just started working first class and didn't want to question Cheryl, who was known for being sharp and no-nonsense. Cheryl said it made her feel uneasy. Back in her seat, Claire's phone buzzed softly on her lap. She glanced down and read the short reply, "Captain notified, let us know if it escalates." She put the phone away without changing her expression. The plane was almost full, and people were putting away their bags, finding seats, and adjusting headrests. The hum of boarding filled the cabin, but CLA did nothing. She had already sent the message, so she didn't need to do anything. The rest would happen on its own. Cheryl returned moments later. She stalked in front of CLA's seat and looked at her with hard eyes. "I spoke with the gate, and they said your ticket checks out, but I need to remind you that first class has expectations. We don't tolerate seat swapping or misunderstandings," she said. "Is that clear?" Claire asked. She slowly turned her head to meet Cheryl's eyes, and there wasn't a single blink. "I never swapped seats," she said in a quiet but firm voice. "There's no misunderstanding." The tension between them lingered for a moment. Cheryl said nothing more. She gave a short nod, and then, they still didn't know who she was, and that would soon matter. The plane's doors closed with a soft thud, and the cabin crew started their final checks. Cheryl moved down the aisle, fixing seat belts and adjusting trays, avoiding Claire's row as if it didn't exist. Claire didn't mind. She had already been pushed aside before she could say a word, and that was enough to tell her everything. In the cockpit, the captain looked over the flight manifest. He had just seen a red alert on his screen that he had never seen before. It said high-level flag odor on board seat 1A, no announcement required monitor treatment. He stared at the message for a moment and then turned to his co-pilot. "We've got someone important on this flight," he said quietly. "Celebrity worse," replied the captain. He didn't press the intercom just yet. He wanted to see how things played out. In the meantime, Cheryl went back to the galley, where Megan was restocking the drink carts when she saw Cheryl. Cheryl asked sharply, "Are you still sitting there?" Megan hesitated. "Yes, her name's on the manifest, and seat 1A is hers," Megan replied. Cheryl frowned, not ready to accept it. "I've worked first class for 12 years, and I know the kind of people who sit up here." Megan stayed quiet, and Cheryl continued to lower her voice. "She's dressed like she just got off a bus, probably got bumped by accident. She showed her ticket twice," Megan said softly, adding, "and she didn't do anything wrong." Cheryl gave her a long look. That sentence hung in the air like a bad smell. Back in her seat, Claire closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the low hum of the cabin and the quiet voices around her. She could hear everything. Her seat wasn't far from the galley, the curtain wasn't fully closed, and Cheryl had spoken loudly enough for everyone in the front rows to hear. She didn't move or react. She just opened her tablet again, tapped it once, and typed in a new password. She put the phone back in her bag and focused her eyes on the road ahead. This was when the real confusion started. The plane slowly crossed the runway, and the usual announcements could be heard throughout the cabin. Seatbelts clicked, and phones were put into airplane mode. CLA leaned back in her seat, her posture calm, and her expression unreadable. She didn't look angry or scared. She looked like she was waiting for the truth to arrive on time a few rows behind Patrick. Since getting on the plane, he couldn't stop wondering how someone dressed so simply got to be in the first row of first class. His wife Rachel told him to stop staring and whispered, "I'm just saying." Patrick replied under his breath, "She doesn't look like the usual crowd up here." Rachel gave him a look but didn't argue. She had also been wondering the same thing. Cheryl, now sitting in her jump seat for takeoff, looked back at the front row again. CLA hadn't asked for anything, not a drink, help with her bag, or any questions. But Cheryl felt challenged, like her authority had been called into question, because someone she didn't think deserved the seat had shown up out of the blue. The plane took off, and as soon as they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign stopped, Cheryl got up and walked to the front of the cabin. She reached for a tray of drinks, then stopped and told Megan, "Don't worry about 1A. I'll take care of her." Megan opened her mouth to say something, but Cheryl was already gone. She walked up to Claire's seat with a fake smile and a glass of sparkling water. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, setting the glass on the tray table without waiting for an answer. "We also have fresh juice, coffee, and champagne for our premium guests," she added. CLA looked up, calm as ever. "You didn't offer me anything before takeoff," she said clearly. Cheryl stiffened. "We were busy getting the cabin ready." "No," Claire said in a soft voice. "You offered everyone else, but you skipped me." Cheryl said nothing for a second, then she gave a short sigh. CLA slowly nodded. "Yes, you are." She picked up the glass and drank without saying a word. Cheryl stood there, not sure what else to say. Her usual competence was starting to slip. She gave a tight nod and turned away as she walked back toward the galley, her face flushing a little. She didn't know why this was bothering her so much. She had questioned passengers before, but something about this one felt different. The silence, the stillness, the way CLA spoke without fear or apology. Unsettling her in the cockpit, the captain got another quiet notification on his screen that said, "Continue monitoring cabin report after landing priority 1." He let out a slow breath and turned to his co-pilot, telling him to keep an eye on the front. "He said something wrong." "Not yet," the captain replied, still watching the screen. "But it's coming." CLA slowly scrolled through her tablet, pretending to read, but her mind was sharp, picking up on every whisper and tone change across the aisle. Patrick had gone quiet. He still looked her way every once in a while, but now it was different. His earlier smirk was gone, and there was discomfort in his eyes, as if he was starting to wonder if he had made the wrong decision about her in the galley. Cheryl was pacing because she didn't like how things felt. That woman in 1A wasn't responding to questions or complaints like most passengers did. There were no nervous explanations or attitude, just silence. That silence was making her nervous. Megan was quietly stacking snack trays next to her, watching. After a moment, she spoke. "Did she say anything to you?" Cheryl shook her head, saying, "Not really." Megan replied, "That doesn't mean she's wrong." Cheryl looked at her with a tight jaw, saying, "You don't belong up here." "I've been in this job long enough to know when something's off." Before Megan could answer, the intercom cracked, and the captain's voice came through smooth and calm. "Cheryl, please report to the cockpit." Megan felt sick to her stomach. Crew weren't called up mid-flight unless something was serious. She wiped her hands on a napkin and walked quickly. The CLA watched her walk away without smiling or reacting. It was quiet in the cockpit. The captain looked up as Cheryl walked in and motioned for her to close the door. "There's something you need to know," he said in a steady voice. "Seat 1A, the woman you confronted at boarding." Cheryl folded her arms and said, "Yes, she's not just a passenger, she's the new owner of the airline." The words hit her like a wave of ice water down her back. "What?" The captain turned the screen toward her and showed her the message flagged by corporate. The name on the message matched the passenger. Manifest CLA Bennett majority shareholder executive override permissions real-time monitoring active. Cheryl felt her breath catch as the captain said, "This isn't a drill, she's here for a reason." Cheryl's throat went dry and her knees felt weak. "I didn't know," she stuttered. "I didn't look like the captain," who narrowed his eyes and said, "Whatever just happened back there you better hope it can be fixed, because when we land there will." Cheryl stood still, feeling the pressure build up inside her. She had questioned the woman who signed the paychecks, and now the plane was about to land because of her bad decision. Cheryl stood in the cockpit, her face pale and her hands tightening around the edge of the console. The hum of the engine felt louder now, as if the silence in the room made everything else ring in her ears. The captain didn't say anything else. The message was already clear, louder than any reprimand she'd ever gotten in her career. Turned slowly and left the cockpit. Each step down the narrow hallway felt heavier than the last. Her polished shoes clicked against the floor, but she didn't trust her walk anymore. Her mind was racing, replaying every word, look, and gesture she had made since CLA boarded. It was like a movie. She couldn't stop thinking about her assumptions, her need to feel in control, and the fact that she wasn't in charge of anything. She pulled back the curtain to the first-class cabin and stood. For a moment, CLA was sitting exactly where she was. Claire didn't have to say anything to make Cheryl feel exposed. Her silence did it all. Megan saw Cheryl come back and stepped aside, sensing that something had changed. Cheryl avoided her gaze and walked back into the galley, pretending to rearrange a tray of glasses while her hands were shaking. Megan waited a few seconds and then spoke. Leaned in and said, "Everything's fine." Cheryl didn't answer at first, but then she said quietly, "She's not just some passenger." "What do you mean? She owns the airline?" Megan blinked and asked, "Are you serious?" Cheryl slowly nodded, finally turning to face Megan and saying, "I've made a mistake, a big one." Megan hadn't said anything to Cheryl face to face, but her hesitation and doubt had told her what she had to do, but Cheryl hadn't listened and had assumed. In the cabin, CLA turned the page on her tablet and reached for her water. She took a slow sip and carefully put the glass back down around her. The energy had changed. Patrick, who had been staring, no longer made eye contact with her. His wife Rachel sat stiffly next to him, clutching her magazine but not reading a word. They had heard enough to put together what was going on. Claire's phone buzzed softly in her bag. She opened it without rushing and read the latest message. The captain confirmed the incident. Logged post-landing arrangements were being made. She put the phone down again with no expression or reaction. A few seats back, Megan walked out of the galley and started helping the other passengers. She did this with her usual quiet efficiency, but she kept looking at Cheryl, who was standing still and staring blankly at the drink cart. Megan had never seen Cheryl like this before. The woman who usually yelled orders and scolded junior staff with a single glance now looked small. When Cheryl finally moved, it was with a slow, reluctant step. As she walked toward CLA's seat, her heart was pounding in her chest, and each beat was louder than the last. She stopped just next to the armrest, took a deep breath, and knelt down a bit. "Miss Bennett," she said, "there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd like to offer my CLA." She said it in a low voice to be polite, and CLA didn't look up. Cheryl's words stuttered, and Claire kept reading. "I didn't know who you were. I thought there was a mistake with the seating," she said. "You didn't question anyone else." CLA spoke with a steady voice and calm eyes. "You still tried to remove me." "I didn't mean to, but you did," she said, cutting her off. "You didn't ask the man in 1B to prove anything. You didn't ask the woman in 2A to prove anything. You just asked me." Cheryl's face turned red as she looked around. Some people were listening, others were pretending not to, but their posture had changed, and everyone could feel the tension rising. CLA uncrossed her legs, sat up straighter, and looked her dead in the eyes. "I'm sorry." Cheryl didn't answer. She stood, stiffly nodded, and walked away as she went back to the galley. Her legs felt weak under her and her chest felt heavy. For the first time in her long career, she was on the other side of judgment and couldn't get away from it. For CLA, the flight wasn't over, the real landing hadn't even started. The hum of the engine continued in the background, steady and calm, but inside the first glass cabin, everything was going crazy. The air was thick with silence after Cheryl's failed apology. No one spoke, but everyone could feel it. It was the kind of silence that happens when something big breaks and a polite smile can't fix it. Claire went back to her tablet and slowly turned the page, but she wasn't reading. Her eyes followed the words, but her attention was elsewhere. She didn't need to say anything else, the weight of the moment had done its job. Everyone who had stared, whispered, or looked the other way was. They were painfully aware of her presence, not because she asked them to be, but because the truth had reached them in a way they couldn't ignore. Cheryl stayed hidden in the galley, her breathing shallow as she gripped the edge of the counter. She hadn't gone back to the cabin since CLA spoke. She couldn't bring herself to walk down that aisle again. Every step would remind her of what she had done, every passenger's glance, every shift of the eye, every quiet judgment. It was all happening now, and she had no way to undo it. Megan moved quietly, taking care of her. She spoke softly and smiled at passengers, but she kept looking at Clarissa's seat as if to see if she needed anything. Clarissa didn't ask for anything, and she didn't even make eye contact, but Megan could tell this was the calm before the storm. Rachel finally broke the silence between her and Patrick. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she thought Patrick heard everything. Patrick nodded. Yeah, she did. Rachel leaned in a little. She didn't do anything wrong, and Patrick admitted regret in his tone. Rachel didn't answer, but the guilt between them was heavy. It wasn't just Cheryl who had made assumptions. Almost everyone in the cabin had been involved in some way, even in the cockpit's silence. The captain got another message from the ground. Flight passenger 1A is to remain seated until escorted, all crew to comply with instructions post-landing. He took a slow breath and adjusted his headset. Check, not just reviewing, he muttered to himself. Cheryl shook her hands and paced back and forth in the galley. Her whole career had been based on order, routine, and control. She followed rules, enforced them, and held others to high standards. But today she had broken something deeper and more ugly. She had made a choice based on what she saw instead of what she knew, and that choice was about to affect everything else in her life. Megan spoke up quietly and without judgment. You need to get ready. Cheryl didn't answer. Cheryl closed her eyes and said, I thought I was just doing my job. Megan said quietly, you were doing what you thought was right, and that's not the same thing. Cheryl didn't answer. She had nothing left to defend herself. In seat 1A, CLA picked up her phone again and sent one last message that said, all confirmed, I'll remain seated, proceed as planned. She put the phone away, sat back, and looked straight ahead. She didn't want revenge, that wasn't the point. She wanted change. There was silence on the plane as it flew at 35,000 feet, but people were already waiting on the ground for a reckoning. The soft chime of the intercom sounded above, and the calm voice of the captain filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending shortly. Please fasten your seat belts and return your tray tables to the upright position, he said. People moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the usual routine felt heavier than usual. The mood in first class wasn't calm or elite, it was tense, uncertain, and full of quiet regret. People who used to look down on CLA now avoided looking at her at all. She hadn't raised her voice or caused any trouble, but her silence said more than any argument could. Patrick tugged on his belt awkwardly. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again after a pause. He leaned slightly toward Clarissa's seat and said, I just wanted to say what happened earlier that was wrong. CLA didn't look at me. I should have said something, but I didn't. I just sat there like it wasn't my business. I guess I just assumed CLA turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. He went quiet right away. People always assume she said something simple, and when they're wrong, they stay quiet. Patrick lowered his gaze and said, You're right, I'm sorry. CLA didn't respond. He wasn't saying it for her, he was saying it for himself. Rachel wiped the corner of her eye. She didn't know why she was so emotional, but something about the way he said it made her feel that way. Rachel had judged her without words, but with silence, and now that silence made her feel guilty. At the front of the plane, Cheryl stood frozen behind the curtain, staring down at the floor and holding on to the edge of the drink cart as the plane started to descend. Every second felt like a countdown, and her throat was dry and her palms were damp. She had spent the last hour trying to think of the right thing to say, the right way to explain it, and the right tone to use. But it didn't matter now. Megan walked up to Cheryl slowly and quietly, her voice low. "Security's at the gate," she said. "They're not here for trouble, just protocol." Cheryl slowly nodded, her eyes far away. "Do you think I'll lose my job?" Megan asked. "I don't know." Megan didn't answer right away, but she did say it softly. It was the most honest thing anyone could have said. CLA stayed calm as the plane began to descend. She fastened her seat belt, put her tablet in her bag, and sat with her back straight outside the window. The clouds parted, revealing the city below. Seeing the tall buildings and the highways winding through the streets like veins, she thought about the thousands of passengers who flew every day, people like her who were questioned, judged, and fired and never had a chance to speak up. She also thought about her father, who started this business from nothing and told her, "The sky doesn't care who you are, but the people in the cabin often do." Now she knew exactly what he meant. As the plane dipped lower, the seatbelt sign went off again, and the landing gear came down. The cabin got too quiet, and so did the cockpit. The captain gave one last update to the ground crew, confirming that passenger 1A was seated. At the gate, a black car was waiting next to the terminal, and 2 security guards and a senior airline executive stood nearby, watching the jet bridge with alert eyes. None of them looked surprised. They had been briefed, and they knew better than to take this lightly. Back on board, Cheryl grabbed the jump seat belt across her chest and stared at the back of the cockpit door. Her mind went over every moment of her voice, tone, and words, including how she had smiled too tightly and tried to make CLA feel small. She had spent her whole career following rules because she thought that made her strong, but now she understood something she hadn't before. Rules didn't matter if they were applied unfairly. The wheels hit the runway with a soft, steady bump. The plane slowed down as it taxied to the gate and finally came to a stop. The chime rang again. "Welcome to your destination." The captain told everyone to stay seated until the seatbelt sign went off. The light above turned off, and the moment Cheryl had been waiting for finally arrived. The door opened, and the consequences began. The door to the plane swung open with a smooth hiss, and a wave of cooler, stranger air filled the cabin. No one stood or moved, and everyone in first class stayed seated with their eyes forward and their breath held. It was as if everyone on the plane knew something important was happening and they didn't want to be a part of it. People watching from the sidelines noticed that CLA didn't move in her seat. Her posture stayed the same, straight and composed. Her bag was still zipped, her belt wasn't fastened, and her hands were resting calmly on her lap. The quiet power in her presence hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger with each minute. At the front door, a tall man in a charcoal suit walked in. His badge, which said Senior Operations, was clipped to his coat, and he looked very professional. Behind him, 2 security officers in Navy uniforms followed not. They weren't trying to scare anyone, they were just following the rules and being accountable. Passengers stared at the scene in silence, pretending not to be interested while watching every detail from behind sunglasses, newspapers, and fake yawns. The man in the suit scanned the cabin until he found Cheryl, who was standing just inside the galley. She was pale and stiff. "Ma'am," and he said firmly, "we need to speak with you. Please gather your belongings and step out with us." Cheryl opened her mouth, but then closed it again. Her legs didn't want to move, but she pushed herself forward as she walked past the passengers she had once served with poise and control. Her shoulders felt heavy, and she could feel their eyes on her, not out of respect but discomfort. She reached CLA's row and stopped for a half second, as if she wanted to say something again. CLA didn't look up, she didn't need to. Cheryl lowered her head and kept walking. The executive turned slightly to let her pass. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Patrick cleared his throat and sat back, shocked by how quickly control had changed hands. Neither of them spoke as Cheryl got off the plane. The door closed behind her with a thud that sounded far too final. Inside the terminal, she was led down a side hallway away from the awaiting passengers. Her heart was racing. She had been through this airport thousands of times before, but now every step felt strange, too loud, too open, too slow, and too final. As Cheryl was led into a small conference room with frosted glass walls, another executive waited with a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She motioned to a chair and said, "Please sit down." She then said, "We've reviewed the incident during Flight 118. Cheryl sat down, her knees shaking. She tried to keep her chin up, but her voice betrayed her. "I didn't know who she was," she began. She didn't look like the woman raised a hand. "This is not about who she is. It's about what you assumed and, more importantly, how you..." Cheryl kept quiet as the executive opened the folder that contained printed statements, reports, and a timeline of the whole flight. "You've worked here for a long time," she continued, "but this isn't the first report filed about your behavior in first class. It's just the first one you couldn't walk away from." Cheryl's mouth dried up as the woman closed the folder and told her, effective immediately, "You're placed on unpaid suspension. A full review will determine if your position with this airline continues." The woman replied, "Is there anything I can do?" But she didn't say what it was. She said, "It starts with recognizing the difference between following policy and enforcing prejudice." Cheryl didn't answer. Back on the plane, Megan quietly finished clearing the trays and saying goodbye to the passengers. As the last few people left, she walked up to Clarissa's row and said, "I'm sorry for everything, not just what happened, but that no one stepped in sooner." CLA looked up at her and said, "Finally, you did more than most." Megan nodded. Crossing her face, she said, "If there's anything you need, please let me know." CLA gave her a small respectful nod. "Thank you, I'll be fine," and she meant it. Megan moved out of the way as CLA Rose got up from her seat, picked up her bag, and walked down the aisle. Her steps were quiet, but they carried the full weight of what had happened and how it had changed things, not just for Cheryl but for everyone who thought power only looked a certain way. At the top of the jet bridge, the executive from earlier waited by the gate. Miss Bennett was greeted with, "Car's ready for you." He then told her that the press had been told about a closed-door briefing with no photos and no chaos, just as she had asked. CLA nodded, and the two of them walked together toward the private exit. This wasn't about attention, it was about responsibility. A black sedan waited outside the private terminal doors, engine running and windows tinted. CLA stepped out of the building with the executive next to her, the weight of the whole flight still hanging in the air around them as they walked to the car. It was only a short distance, but it felt longer than any runway she'd ever crossed. There were no people or cameras around, just a moment of silence between what had happened in the sky and what needed to happen next on the ground. The driver opened the back door without saying a word, and CLA slid in smoothly. The door shut behind her with a soft click, and the car pulled away, leaving behind the terminal, the plane, and a storm of conversations that had already started in the airline's upper ranks. In the car, she didn't grab her phone or tablet or scroll. She stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the tinted glass. The buildings moved slowly by, casting long shadows across the pavement. She thought about the people who were still in the terminal and had seen everything happen but didn't say a word until it was over. She didn't blame them. Silence was easier and safer, but it was what let things like this keep happening. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, and she finally took it out to check her messages. Bartle-Haynes' review meeting was this afternoon. All internal reports had been sent in. Would you like to attend in person or remotely? Claire typed a simple reply in person. She put the phone on the seat next to her and leaned her head back. The leather was cool and smooth, but her mind wasn't at ease. She wasn't angry in the way that most people would expect. She wasn't the type to yell, threaten, or embarrass in return. That wasn't how change lasted. All she wanted was an apology. She wanted the culture to change the judgment that lived in. Uniforms, smiles, and tones of voice that had to be dragged out into the open and made uncomfortable. The car pulled into the underground parking entrance of the company's headquarters, and the security staff nodded as they went by. Moments later, CLA got out and walked through the familiar glass doors of the executive wing. Inside, a row of senior leaders sat waiting, some of whom had worked for her father and others of whom had only known her as the quiet person in the back of boardrooms who listened more. She didn't smile or sit down when she walked into the room. Instead, she went straight to the head of the table and gently put her bag down. The woman in charge of the meeting, Lydia, head of policy and compliance, stood to greet her and said, "Miss Bennett, thank you for coming in person." Claire nodded and said, "This can't be fixed from behind a screen." Lydia gave Claire a short smile and pointed to the seat, where CLA was sitting calmly and ready. A big monitor lit up at the far end of the room. Screenshots from the flight, crew assignments, and messages sent from the cockpit leave a full digital record of what happened. Lydia opened a file and said, "We've gone over the whole timeline." Claire said, "Cheryl Martin has been suspended pending further investigation. She's admitted to making assumptions, but she's asked for a chance to respond formally." "Get that chance, Claire." Lydia nodded. "We've also received 2 additional crew reports from previous flights referencing similar behavior without action." When asked why past passengers hadn't filed formal complaints, CLA raised an eyebrow. "Because they feel ignored or don't think anything will change," Lydia replied, her tone tightening. "That's what I want to fix," Claire said. "Starting now," she said, pulling out a thin folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "This is a draft policy for bias awareness training for all staff. Anonymous passengers reporting random reviews of first-class service footage, and every single formal or." The room was silent. "Anyone who sees a passenger as a problem because they don't fit their idea of wealth doesn't belong in a position of service," Claire continued. "We don't need more apologies, we need prevention." Someone at the far end cleared his throat. "Wouldn't that make the union angry?" Claire cut him off politely but firmly. "They can be angry about fair treatment if they want to, but not while wearing our uniform." Lydia looked down at the folder and then up at Claire. "We'll move it forward. People need to know that we're not ignoring this," so Claire nodded once and said, "Make it public." The meeting went on for another 30 minutes, and there were more details, timelines, and policy language. But the tone had changed. No one questioned her authority or her intentions. What happened on Flight 118 wasn't just a mistake, it was a mirror, and now the airline had to face its reflection. When the meeting was over, Claire stood up and gathered her things. "Miss Bennett," Lydia said quietly as CLA reached the door, "one more thing, Cheryl." Claire paused for a second, then shook her head no, and she walked out. She wasn't done yet, she was just getting started. CLA walked out of the boardroom with the same quiet grace she had carried throughout the flight, but as the door closed behind her, the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. The hallways of the headquarters felt colder, not physically, but emotionally. This was the same building where she had once accompanied her father to a meeting. He taught her how to speak softly and still be heard in a world where he had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. As she walked by framed portraits of former executives and glass walls showing open offices and employees typing away, most people didn't look up, but the few who did gave her that same look that was half curiosity, half respect, and something else. She was finally aware of who she was, not just the CEO's daughter or the owner's daughter. She was now the symbol of something. With a calm face, CLA walked into her corner office and closed the door behind her. She put her bag on the small table next to the window, walked to her desk, and sat down slowly for a moment. She just stared at the big screen in front of her for a moment, with no messages or alerts. There was just the soft glow of a desktop that had been quiet for too long. When she opened her inbox, she saw that there were over 200 new emails, some from corporate teams, news outlets, and flight passengers. She ignored them all and opened the folder labeled Incident Reports. At the top of the folder was the one she was looking for, a formal apology from Cheryl Martin. She moved the mouse over it for a moment and then pushed it aside. She wasn't ready, not because she was mad, she just didn't need another explanation to understand what was already clear. The apology wasn't the problem, the mindset was. Her assistant, Leo, a young man who was always sharp and precise, Claire, stepped in. Said the press team wants a public statement and wants to know if you'll speak on the record. CLA looked up and saw that they already knew. Yes, someone from the flight posted photos and a video of Cheryl being escorted off the plane. CLA let out a sigh of relief. She wasn't surprised. Were they spinning it yet? Some are calling it a power move, Leo said, while others are praising you for staying calm. Some are saying you embarrassed her. Claire raised her eyebrows and agreed. Leo nodded. That's the word they're using. Claire leaned back in her chair and Leo hesitated, then said, you should know that a former employee also reached out. She says Cheryl did something similar to her last year, but no one believed her, so she quit the company after filing a complaint that went nowhere. CLA closed her eyes for a second that hit her harder than she thought it would. Get her on the phone, Leo said, and tell her we're listening now. CLA nodded, and Leo left her alone across the city in a simple apartment with curtains drawn and a. Cheryl sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the email she had just sent. It was an apology for breaking something, and it was her last attempt to fix it. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her glass of water, and she could barely hold it steady. She had spent her career thinking she was fair and doing her job right, but now the silence on the other end of her apology told her something else, that being fair only applied to people who looked the way she thought it should. The TV played quietly in the background. A news segment was showing photos of CLA getting on the plane and a blurred video of Cheryl being escorted off by a group of commentators who were talking about racial bias and discrimination in the sky. In first class, her name hadn't been called yet, but she knew it would be. In her mind, she wasn't a bad person, but now the world saw her as an example and a lesson. What was worse was that she knew why. Back at the office, Claire opened a new document and started typing a statement, but not for the press or the headlines. For every worker who had ever doubted someone because they didn't look the part, for every customer who had been ignored, questioned, or fired, for the former worker Leo mentioned, the one who was pushed out without a second thought, she continued. Respect isn't a perk of a job title, it's a basic expectation. And if someone in this company can't give it to every customer the same way, they shouldn't be here. This wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who was on Flight 118. Our goal is not just to fix a policy, it's to reset the culture, she wrote, reading it twice and then sending it to the internal communications team. Let the world say what it wanted, she said, knowing that she wasn't trying to make a point. She was just fixing a system. The next morning, the world had already changed. CLA arrived at headquarters before the sun fully lit the city skyline. The office was quiet and the halls were almost empty, but the buzz had started hours earlier. Tablets, phones, and office monitors. Airline CEO is embarrassed mid-flight and reacts without saying a word. Executive passenger profiled on her own airline's flight that changed company policy overnight. Video goes viral. It's only 15 seconds long but sharp and unforgettable. Cheryl walks past the first-class rows with her posture tight and face pale. CLA sits there silently, not even glancing at her. That picture is everywhere. She has become a symbol. Claire walks into her office with a coffee in one hand. She had a bag over her shoulder and Leo stood next to her desk, scrolling through a tablet. "We've had over 30 interview requests," he said. 3 talk shows, 2 business panels, and a national news anchor offering a private interview are not interested. "This isn't a campaign," Claire said calmly, setting her things down. Leo nodded, understanding. "What about internal?" she asked. "We sent your statement company-wide last night." He said. "It's being shared like wildfire," she said. "Department heads are already setting up sensitivity training in our policy." The review team said that this was the biggest overnight increase in employee engagement in years. CLA leaned against the edge of her desk in case Leo responded. Some senior staff members thought it was too much, too fast. One even said that you made an example out of Cheryl. Leo gave Claire a tight nod and said, "I didn't make an example of her. She made herself the example." The former flight attendant who quit because of Cheryl agreed to talk to HR and will be there tomorrow. CLA looked away for a moment. Cheryl sat in her apartment wearing yesterday's clothes with her laptop open on the table in front of her. Her inbox was full of messages from friends and coworkers asking what happened, some reaching out to offer support, others remaining silent. Some messages were mean, some were brutally honest, and one from her younger sister said, "Did you really say that to her?" She hadn't replied, so she kept refreshing her screen, hoping for some sign that an apology had been read and something had been acknowledged, but nothing came. As the hours went by, it became more clear to her that she wasn't the victim. For so long, she had thought she knew people by how they looked, dressed, and behaved. She hadn't seen herself as biased, but now she knew that bias doesn't have to shout to be dangerous. It shows up in doubtful tone and subtle control. She watched the video clip again and saw the fear on her face as she walked down the aisle. Then saw Claire, who looked calm and unmoved. Cheryl didn't recognize the woman in the mirror anymore. She didn't like what she saw, but she knew it was her. At headquarters, Claire was in the main conference room with the training division. There were directors, trainers, and department heads all looking at her. On the screen behind her, the first slide of her new initiative was shown. "What you see is what you assume is what must change." Claire spoke slowly. "We don't teach perception, we teach." She walked up to the screen and tapped the corner of the remote. The picture changed to a plain first-class cabin with no people in it. "This is what the average crew member sees every day," she said. "But for someone like me or anyone who doesn't fit the image they expect, this space becomes a test of patience, dignity, and how far someone is willing to go before asking, 'Do you belong here?'" She clicked again, and a still frame of Cheryl confronting her on the plane showed up. "I don't." She did something unexpected. She clicked again, and the screen showed a short letter. It was Cheryl's apology. CLA read it out loud. "I now understand that I didn't just doubt your seat, I doubted your right to be in that space because you didn't fit what I expect. That wasn't about protocol, that was about bias, and I carry that mistake fully." She then turned back to the group and said, "This isn't about punishing Cheryl. It's about making sure there are no more Cheryls." Someone in the back of the room raised their hand and asked, "Do you think she meant that apology?" CLA paused and then said, "I don't know, but even if she didn't mean it when she wrote it, maybe reading it out loud in this room will help someone else mean it when it matters." When the meeting was over, people didn't rush out like they usually do. They lingered, thoughtful, and some went up to CLA to say thank you, while others walked out without saying a word. Later that night, CLA stood by the window again. In the distance, city lights blinked softly, and the airline's logo shone on the tower across the street. It had been her father's dream, and now it was hers. But it was becoming more than a business, it was becoming a platform. Her phone rang, and it was a new message from Cheryl. "Thank you for reading my apology." She knew she didn't deserve your forgiveness, but she wanted to know if that was still okay. Claire looked at the message for a long time before typing a reply. "Let's see what you do next." She hit send. It was never about revenge, it was always about responsibility. In the days that followed, the quiet spark of a single flight turned into a wildfire of conversation. The story stopped being news, but it stayed in people's minds in airport lounges, break rooms, and flight attendant training centers. Claire Bennett's name was no longer just linked to the title of CEO. It had become a line in a bigger conversation about the way people at the airline headquarters decided who belonged where had changed slowly but surely. Meetings that used to be strict and formal turned into open conversations, and employees started talking about things they'd been keeping quiet about for years. Cabin crew shared stories they'd buried, and ticket agents admitted to times they now regretted saying, "That's just how it is," in internal memos. CLA moved through it all like it was nothing. She made sure that every choice she made during those days had a purpose. She went to training workshops not as an observer but as a participant. She sat next to junior employees and asked questions and listened. She made it clear that this wasn't just about one incident but about everything that led up to it. The new training module started within 2 weeks and was required for all employees, from executives to part-time workers. The title was "Simple Assumption is Not." That's why it's dangerous. The first slide had no pictures, just a quote: "Bias doesn't wear a uniform, it wears comfort." The modules didn't just focus on race or appearance, they also looked at language, tone of voice, and the things people don't say but still communicate. Every lesson included role-play footage from real flights, anonymous employee stories, and one case study that every team Rev A6 Flight 118 during one of the workshops. A young trainee named Melissa raised her hand when the last video ended. Shook a little. "What if we mess up?" she asked. "What if we still say or do the wrong thing without realizing it?" Claire, who was sitting in the back, got up and walked to the front without being told to. The facilitator didn't lecture, she just spoke the same steady truth she'd used from the beginning. "You will mess up. We all will. That's human. But when it happens, what matters is whether you double down or step back and ask why." She looked around the room and saw dozens of faces, young and old, watching her like a dog. "This isn't about perfection," she said. "It's about presence and not letting your habits speak louder than your humanity." There was silence in the room, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind anymore. It was reflection. Meanwhile, back in Cheryl's world, the silence was a different kind. She had started her required sessions quietly, sitting in the back of each training room and avoiding eye contact. On the first day, her notepad was almost empty, but as she listened, something changed. She saw reflections of. During a small group exercise on the third day, she spoke for the first time. "I didn't think I was that kind of person," she said. "I always believed I treated everyone the same, but now I see I was treating people based on what I expected from them, not what they deserved." Her voice broke a little, and she cleared her throat. "I made someone feel small just for existing in a place. That wasn't a mistake, It was me needing to be more than I was willing to admit. The room didn't applaud. No one needed to. The moment didn't ask for praise. It asked for truth. Later that week, Cheryl finally answered. She asked for a face-to-face meeting with CLA. It wasn't required. In fact, no one encouraged it. She wanted to talk not to save her job but to take responsibility for her actions. The meeting was set up quietly. There was no official announcement. It was just two people in a small, sunny conference room with a picture of water. Cheryl sat across from CLA, calm but nervous. She wasn't wearing a uniform or acting professionally. She was just a woman facing someone she had wronged. "I want to thank you for not destroying me," she said clearly. "You had every chance." Claire looked at her calmly and replied, "I didn't want to destroy you. I wanted you to understand the damage you almost did." Cheryl nodded. "I do now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to hear me say that I'm trying to become someone who would have treated you differently." Then she said, "Make sure you treat everyone differently, not just people like me." There was silence after that, not tense or angry, just two people understanding the long road between recognition and repair. When the meeting was over, CLA walked Cheryl to the door without shaking hands or putting on a show. There was just a quiet moment of acknowledgement, and as Cheryl walked out into the hallway, she didn't feel finished, but she felt like something new was ready to begin. 2 months later, the story. Newer, louder scandals and outrage had replaced the story of Flight 118 in the news, but it hadn't got away at all within the airline or in the culture that CLA had quietly changed. The ripple effect of that one flight had turned into a wave of change not just in procedures or training manuals, but also in conversations, in how employees carried themselves, and in how passengers were watched not for what they looked like but for how they were treated. Claire sat alone in her office that morning, looking out at the skyline. There was a report on her desk that was a quarterly feedback analysis of the passenger experience. It had over 20,000 anonymous comments from people across the country that were collected after the changes went into effect. As she skimmed the pages, phrases like "I was treated like I belonged for the first time in a long time" and "I wasn't judged when I walked into first class wearing work boots" caught her attention. She smiled slightly and traced one of the comments with her fingers. This was a branding. Leo stepped in with a folder and asked, "Morning, you asked for a follow-up on Cheryl's transition." CLA looked up and said, "Let's hear it." Leo sat across from her and said, "She completed all 6 advanced training modules, voluntarily attended 2 weekend forums, gave 3 peer sessions to incoming crew. Her evaluations were clean, actually better than clean. She's been requested by passengers for return flights." CLA raised an eyebrow and said, "Interesting." Leo nodded. "Her tone is different, her posture is different." One of the crew leads told her she's not trying to be forgiven, she's just trying to be helpful. CLA leaned back in her chair, thinking. The woman she wronged last year has been hired back, but not in the same role. She's now on the team that reviews in-flight conduct reports. Her first task was to come up with a faster way to review behavior complaints, she said. Leo turned a page, she said. "People lose hope when they feel unseen. Our job is to see them before they disappear." CLA was quiet for a long time. While looking out the window at the city, past Leo, she didn't blow up on that flight or curse or call for public revenge because she knew something that most people didn't. The most powerful change often doesn't look like fire. It looks like water, quiet, persistent, and eventually it cuts through. Stone set up a meeting and asked, "Do you want to talk to both of them together?" Leo nodded. "Anything else?" Claire asked, lifting the feedback report. "Let's highlight these." Leo smiled and said, "That's going to make a difference." Claire nodded and said, "It already is." Across the building, in a simple break room, Cheryl poured herself a cup of coffee. The room was full of laughter and chatter about flight schedules and date changes. For once, she wasn't hiding in silence, she was listening. A junior flight attendant came up to her and said, "Hey Cheryl, remember that thing you said in training about checking your eyes before? Check someone's ticket, you said, and that stuck with me." Cheryl looked up, surprised that you remembered that. The young woman nodded, as if you were talking about someone who had been bad at their own habits. Cheryl gave a small, tired smile. "That's because I have." The girl nodded respectfully. It helped. "Just so you knew," Cheryl nodded back. "Thank you." She's still learning. Back in CLA's office, the door stayed open. She didn't like keeping it shut anymore. She wanted people to come in and disagree if they needed to. That afternoon, Claire walked in. The staff was used to seeing her at the training center without being asked, not as a boss but as someone who showed up and didn't hover. She sat in the back and watched today as a young trainer led a group of new hires. On the screen was a single question: what does respect look like when no one is looking? CLA closed her eyes for a second and thought about the time Cheryl had stood over her and asked her about her seat. She remembered the silence and what it felt like not to yell. She didn't want to be remembered for the flight, she wanted to be remembered for what happened after it. 6 months later, the airline had changed, not in slogans or scripted commercials, but in small, often unseen ways that showed whether the change was real or just acting. For example, date agents no longer scanned people's clothes before they bought their boarding passes, and flight attendants, even the experienced ones who used to complain about corporate interference, started. Claire walked through one of the airline's busiest terminals without being seen. She wore dark jeans and a navy jacket, and her only carry was a small shoulder bag. She asked passengers if they were comfortable by not only offering champagne but also eye contact. The staff directory included new hires from underrepresented groups whose voices had been quiet in the background but were now leading orientation sessions. A policy change that began on a single flight was now ingrained in every level of the company. She didn't want a tour, she just wanted a moment to herself. No one recognized her, which was exactly what she wanted. She stopped near gate 42 and watched the boarding process. A young man in a wrinkled hoodie approached the desk. The date agent, a woman in her early 30s, smiled and asked for a boarding pass. He handed it over with a slightly uncertain look on his face. "Welcome aboard," she said, checking her screen. There were no raised eyebrows, no second glance, and no hesitation. As she walked toward her gate, a hurried teenage girl almost dropped her carry-on. CLA reached out and steadied the bag before it fell. The girl turned around and said, "Sorry, I didn't see you." "It's okay," CLA sang in a soft voice. "Travel days are chaos," the girl said with an awkward smile. "Are you?" CLA Bennett asked. "Yes." The girl's eyes widened as she realized she was the woman they tried to help on that flight. And the girl looked shocked. "I watched the video a dozen times and you didn't say a word, you just sat there, and they lost everything." Claire tilted her head. "I didn't want them to lose everything. I just wanted them to realize they weren't seeing people, only appearances." The girl slowly nodded. "It helped me. I've always been afraid of how people look at me when I speak up, but you didn't have to shout. You just let the truth do the work." Claire's smile grew bigger. "What happened to the woman?" the girl asked quietly. "She's still here," CLA replied. "She changed." The girl looked surprised and apologized. "Yes," CLA said. "But more importantly, she changed." The boarding call for CLA's flight echoed over the intercom. "Looks like that's me," she said, picking up her bag. The girl stepped aside and watched her with the kind of admiration that's usually reserved for actors. You changed a whole company? CLA paused for a second. No, she said softly. The company changed itself. As CLA walked down the jet bridge, she saw a flight attendant greeting passengers with a genuine smile. Welcome aboard, the woman said, nodding respectfully. CLA nodded back, meeting her eyes in a way that showed there was no recognition. There was only professionalism, fairness, and neutrality, which was all she had ever wanted. She found her seat, this time in first class, still at the front of the cabin, but no one looked at her with doubt and no one whispered asked why she was there. In fact, a man in the row across offered to. Because she looked like any other traveler, she smiled and took her seat. As the plane filled with people, the safe announcement started, and the engines warmed up. CLA looked out the window, but not at the sky. Instead, she looked at a reflection of herself, not as the woman who owned the airline, not as the woman from that flight, but as a woman who turned silence into change. As the wheels took off, she closed her eyes not to escape something, but because she could finally rest. Justice didn't come. It looked like this, a quiet seat in the back row, where no one asked if she belonged, because now everyone finally got it, she always did. If this story moved you, please like it and share your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon.